Alright, let's talk a bit about debugging. So first we're going to start with an example. And before we can dive into the code, let's just define a term. Our code is going to involve palindromes, that is, terms that are the same forwards as they are backwards. Say we have two functions, isPal and isPalN. Let's say isPal expects a list as its input and will return either true or false, depending on whether that list is a palindrome. In this case, what we mean by palindrome is a list where it's identical forwards as it is when you reverse all the terms of the list, or when you reverse the order of all the list elements. We also have this function isPalN, which expects an integer and a list. isPalN will print out is a palindrome or is not a palindrome, depending on whether the first n elements of the list form a palindrome. That is, if the first n elements of the list are the same forwards as they are when reversed. So, now I'd like you to, on your own as an exercise, come up with some possible inputs to isPal and what it should output in each case. Try coming up with an input when isPal should return false, and an input when isPal should return true. Additionally, come up with possible inputs for isPalN. One input where isPalN should print out is a palindrome, and another set of inputs where isPalN should return is not a palindrome. So I'll give you, say, 5 seconds for that. Pause right here while you try it out. Alright, let's go through an example together. So the reason I asked you to come up with some example inputs and outputs is because this is the first step in writing your own doc tests. So far in this class, we've been providing doc tests for you, but moving forward, it's really important for you to be able to define these tests on your own, because out in the real world, a lot of the time, tests won't be written for you, and you have to reason about your expected inputs and outputs just given a problem statement. So let's try it out. So, let me pull up some code for isPalindrome, or isPal rather. So for isPal, let's try defining a situation where isPal should return true. Say isPal is expecting a list of 1, 2, 1. That list is the same both forwards and backwards, so this should output true. On the other hand, if isPal takes in a list, say, just 1, 2, that list is not the same forwards and backwards, so isPal should return false. And so here you see the syntax for defining doc tests, right? We have a set of 3 quotation marks at the top and 3 quotation marks at the bottom, encapsulating our doc tests, and then we define each of the function calls for a given function with the expected input and then the expected output. And now I have some tests for isPal. So now that I have some tests, let's check if isPal is working as defined in our problem spec. So here's just an example of how to run your doc tests. Python 3-m doc test, and then whatever your file name is. And this command will run all the doc tests defined in your file, and it'll make outputs whenever any of your doc tests fail. Oh man, so already my first doc test failed. isPal called on 1 and 2. So this was the case where isPal should be returning false, but instead it's returning true. Okay, this is helpful. And let's also try out some doc tests for isPalN, but we already can see here, isPalN calls isPal, so it's doubtful that it's going to behave as expected, right? isPalN is relying on isPal working, but it looks like isPal isn't functioning, so it probably won't work either. But it's still useful for us to define some tests, so later on we can debug and try passing those tests once we fix up the first function. So let's try that. Let's say a potential input for isPalN would be take the first 2 elements of the list 1, 2, 1. And as we showed earlier, that should return false, right? Because the first two elements of this three element list are just 1 and 2, and 1, 2 forwards is not the same as 1, 2 backwards. So this should return, or rather it should print, is not a palindrome. Additionally, let's have a positive case. So let's say ispalin takes in 3 and then a list 1, 2, 1, 2. The first 3 elements of this list do form a palindrome, so it should return, or should print out, is a palindrome. So, quick question for you all. Do you notice any issues with my code right now? Does my intended input and output make sense? So, I'll give you a second to try and look at this, maybe pause if you want, and try to find whether there's an issue with the doc test I've defined. Alright, you might have noticed it. The issue here is that ispal, we said, will print is a palindrome or is not a palindrome. And it's a tiny detail, but remember that when we're printing out strings, we don't include the quotation marks. So this is another thing to really keep in mind. We need to be careful when we're defining our doc tests to make sure they always match our expected output, that we are being accurate when we define the expected inputs and outputs. Our doc tests can have bugs as well. Cool. So that was just an example of running doc tests, or defining them and as well as running them. Let's see if these fail as well. So I'm going to run the same command. Yeah, looks like my doc test from ispal is still failing, as well as my doc test in ispaln. Alright, so in the next video we're going to get into how to actually find our bugs and fix them.